Welcome to Talk+Water, the podcast that takes a deep dive into the world of water with those making waves. My name is Todd Votteler, and I'm your host for Talk+Water. I'm also the principal of Collaborative Water Resolution, which you can find at waterdisputes.org. And in addition, I'm editor-in-chief of Texas+Water and the Texas+Water Journal. Both publications are free. My guests today are Jayme Lozano Carver and Alejandra Martinez. Jayme Lozano Carver is the Texas Tribune's first Lubbock-based reporter, covering the South Plains and Panhandle through a partnership with Report for America. Jayme previously worked for the Texas Tech Public Media and Lubbock's NPR station, where she spearheaded a series called Rural Healthcare, the Other Texas Drought, which was on PBS Frontline. And it covered rural hospitals being closed in Texas. That sounds very interesting. Alejandra Martinez joined the Tribune in the fall of 2022 as the Fort Worth-based environmental reporter for the Tribune. Alejandra was previously an accountability reporter at KERA, where she began as a Report for America Corps lead member, and then covered Dallas City Hall. Before that, she worked as an associate producer at WLRN, South Florida's public radio station. Jayme, Alejandra, welcome and thank you for being part of Talk+Water.
Thank you so much for having us.
So, let's start out with your backgrounds in water. This is something, I always ask everybody, kind of, trying to find out, even if you're not, in a profession where you're thinking about water all the time, what first got you interested in it? So, Jayme, when did you first become interested in water?
Well, it really started just from growing up here in the South Plains. I worked at United in Levelland as a teenager. And every time I carried out groceries for, the older farmers coming in, they would always talk about the drought, how bad we needed the rain. And it kind of really made me aware back then. And I even remember thinking, why don't they just water it themselves if the rain's not coming? And, of course, I didn't know how complicated that answer actually is. And then as I got older, I would see boil water notices pop up in the small towns around Levelland and Lubbock. And it just really got me curious about why our water out here is so bad. So a lot of my interest did come from just living in an area with these issues.
That sounds like what your series is all about, what you just described, your experience growing up.
Yeah, I took some inspiration from it.
So, Alejandra, same question. What got you interested in water?
Yeah, so I grew up in Houston. So I think my first relationship with water was during hurricanes. Honestly, there had been times that during hurricanes, we go into boil water notices and, we have already prepared by, buying bottled water. But if I just remember my mother cooking, or I guess boiling water on the stove. And it just so happened that when I became a reporter, I had to cover a couple of those that happened in Dallas. And then one of the first stories I did for the Tribune was last year's Houston boil water notice. And Jayme had covered before that, or I think after that, shortly after that, a really good reporting package looking at boil water notices all across the state. And I thought there's so much more to dive into here.
That's interesting. You both have kind of a very different water experience growing up. I mean, so you're growing up in Houston, and then you're living in Florida, Alejandra, where both places, a lot of rainfall, a lot of water. And then Jayme, you're up in the, I guess it's, right on the edge of the Panhandle, right? It's not really the Panhandle, but, the South Plains, where you may not get all that much rain every year. And on average, it's nothing like what Houston gets.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly the case, and Pooja Salhotra, she's our East Texas reporter with the Tribune, and she worked with us on this project, and she very much kind of had the same experiences. Even right now, she lives in Lufkin, she's covering East Texas out there, and she would see a lot of the boil water notices pop up, a lot of these leaks, not necessarily a problem with supply, more quality. Whereas out here in West Texas, I'm seeing more of the supply issue and some of the quality. And so it really just varies. And I think that was part of us being able to all contribute to our water coverage.
Yeah. And adding to what Jayme's saying, I think that's kind of what even helped more of this water coverage, because we're all spread out across the state and we all had these unique and different experiences with water growing up in Texas. So I think something we really strive to do at this project is create a picture for what is going on with water in Texas.
Right. And, what y'all just said also kind of points out one of the things that's, I think interesting about water management in Texas is, you do have, part of the state that, gets a lot of rainfall. And then you've got another part of the state that really doesn't get much at all. And we have essentially the same, set of rules for the most part, governing surface water and groundwater management that cover that entire state. And it's maybe not ideally suited to, having kind of extremes in climate like that. The way it's set up, I mean, there is some regional options in terms of groundwater management districts and things that they can do, but it's a tough thing having a set of rules and regulations that have to apply to such a large place with such enormous variations in terms of the climate and the water situation. So let's kind of go off from there and just go ahead and start talking about the Tribune's Broken Pipes series. So can you tell us kind of, how this came together? And it's a series of articles, which I've read, and I thought y'all did a great job. Can you kind of describe it generally and what some of the interesting findings were?
Yeah. So, we, I guess kind of starting off, we started covering this kind of at the start of our team being started, the Regions team at the Tribune. One of the first stories that I covered was the water line break last summer in Odessa, which had to do with, or which was the cause of a older pipe. So that immediately piqued my curiosity. And then I know Alejandra and Pooja have also both kind of had that same curiosity whenever these issues come up. But that's really how it started. Over the last few months of us all working together, we saw how aging infrastructure was affecting our respective areas of the state, whether it be boil water notices or water line breaks and water loss. So we wanted to dive deeper into that. And we knew that the magnitude of what we were covering was going to be massive, just like Texas is.
Right.
But, we looked into the age of pipes. We looked into water loss audits. We pulled years worth of boil water notices to ultimately get to the Broken Pipes Project. And, like you said, it is a series of articles because as we were working on it, our initial plan was just one big article, and we had to split it up. There was just really no way of covering everything all in one story. So that's where, we decided, okay, let's split it up into water quality here, water supply here, and what the people who are living out here are doing to address it. And so, another part of that too is we did see that these issues are impacting rural communities more, which I think all three of us kind of tend to gravitate towards more in our coverage. And so we wanted to keep them in mind, and we wanted to talk to the people responsible for our water, not just lawmakers, but city managers and water districts. So it was really, a project that we were all hoping to cover a lot of ground on.
And beyond also the people who are working with water, the people impacted by, the water infrastructure or the lack thereof, a part of this project was also, the story focusing on Las Colonias, which are these Texas-Mexico border communities that do not have, for the most part, water infrastructure, traditional water infrastructure, pipes going into their homes. And initially, I was interested in this specific side of the story. And once I saw what the regional team was doing, I thought that would be great to join their efforts and kind of dive into those questions of why this particular Latinx community doesn't have water infrastructure. How did this community get there? And how is that impacting their water quality, which was another aspect of the regional Broken Pipes project.
Well, since you brought up colonias, let's talk about that for a minute. So when I first started out, kind of my water career in the late 80s, there was all sorts of discussion about colonias then. And it looked like the state was moving to try to address their water needs. And then, it doesn't look like much happened. And they're kind of in the same situation, except for, when I was reading your articles, it seems like kind of the pattern is that if they ever get the infrastructure they need, it's because they're annexed or something, they're near a city or a small town, and maybe it's growing, and then they add that area, and then they get it. But for the most part, they don't get the kind of infrastructure that they need, and they're having to, truck in water and do things like that, it's really expensive. I mean, compared to, if you just compare to the price per 1,000 gallons, what people pay out of their tap in a large city compared to what somebody's paying who's got to have a truck come and deliver water to their water tank, or you just use bottled water. That's really expensive.
I mean, talk about one lady who says she pays $180 biweekly to get this tank of water that holds, I think, about 30,000, I want to believe, if I remember that right, gallons of water. That is incredibly expensive. And for, people who might be listening who don't really know about the colonias, I kind of wanted to give a historical background real quick before I get to your questions. But these communities are found the majority along the Texas-Mexico border. They trace back to 1950s and 60s. The developers purchased at the time these plots of land that were described as less desirable because they were susceptible to flooding. They weren't really good for agriculture or growing crops. But at the time, there wasn't a law in Texas that would kind of prevent them from selling them. So they sold them anyway. And they sold them to Mexican migrants who were coming to the States to, a better life, working in agriculture or manufacturing. So when I think about the Colonia communities, I think about how it's very emblematic of what that American dream is for these people. The story of migration and migrating with that promise of prosperity and a better life. And so that's what they did. They bought these cheap, lands or cheaper lands, and hope for a better future. And developers promised them these areas would prosper with, getting water infrastructure and all these other basic needs. And to this day, thousands of these small little pocket communities continue to live without water infrastructure, electricity, sewage, and plumbing. So the story that I told was we were looking at this, massive piece of legislation that would, pour in money for water infrastructure, would this money reach Colonia communities? And I will give the state of Texas credit. They have implemented programs in the past that have helped some colonias get water infrastructure. But is funding always guaranteed for those programs? Does funding always flood into those programs? And also, how easy is it, is it easy at all for communities who might not always even have, to this day, internet or a community center where they can get help to apply for this grant funding? And you mentioned the whole, these communities basically have to get eaten up or sucked into a big city for the most part, to get water infrastructure. And speaking to organizers and professors and leaders who have worked with colonias for decades, they say that that's been historically the only way these communities can get their water infrastructure.
Does anyone have an estimate of how many people live in colonias in Texas? So you said there are thousands of them, but I'm wondering if you ever saw a figure like that.
The most recent figure, it's from, I think, 2016. There hasn't been a more recent audit of like how many people live there, but they were estimating 500,000 people, and most of them are U.S. citizens based on census information that they have. So that's one of the so-called myths of these communities is, they were originally Mexican migrants, but they got their citizenship, or they are people who were born in the States now who continue to live there. So we're talking about U.S. citizens who don't have water infrastructure in their home.
Right. And it sounds like, I guess there's no, I guess, legal way to get, whoever the developers were originally, or those, companies or whoever to come back and fulfill the promises that they made. It sounds like.
Yeah. And that's part of the frustration I've heard. And also these people own the home, but because it was basically sold in such a, quote, shady way, they don't always have the paperwork needed to even sell that property or sell it off. And also, how easy would it be to sell a property that doesn't have water infrastructure or doesn't live in a place where there's other community services?
Right.
So they're kind of stuck there.
Right. It's kind of the opposite of what you see in a state like Washington State, where, you can buy some property, but you can't build anything unless you have an assured water supply. And if you're out in the rural parts of that state, that means you have to purchase a water right or a portion of a water right that's available. And so we don't have anything like that here. So Jayme, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the issues that you or looking at with boil water notices and water quality issues. There's I've looked into this a little bit myself in recent years and noticed, wow, it seems like there are more and more of these notices being issued. What can you tell us about that in relationship to the research you did?
Yeah, so it's actually something that we did find in the Broken Pipes project. Like I mentioned, we requested and analyzed 10 years worth of data from the Texas Water Development Board. And, it still surprises me, honestly, to really think about the numbers that we saw from that. Because, from 2018 to 2022, there were 55% more boil water notices in just those 4 years than the previous 5 years. And so whenever we put numbers out there like that, it may not really, mean a lot to somebody who doesn't know. But to boil it down, no pun intended,
we're all for puns here.
I love a good water pun, in case y'all haven't figured it out. But there were just over 3,000 boil water notices issued last year. And in the first 3 months of this year, there have already been 759. So, we know that partially, another issue with these boil water notices is that they can come up really at small or big levels of contamination or harm to the public safety. And so it's something that, even though we see it all around the state, and particularly in rural communities, our data did show that they pop up more in East Texas than anywhere else in the state.
That surprised me. I was surprised it was East Texas.
And I think the reason why is because, like I mentioned earlier, they don't have the issue of supply, right? East Texas, they have the water, it's out there. I think that part of why they're seeing so much of that out there is not only because of how much water is out there, but because of how many rural communities you have out there that are having this aging infrastructure that they can't really repair. And so I think, that's why we see it there. But like I mentioned earlier, too, we've had issues out here in West Texas for so long as well. They're just not as prevalent as in East Texas.
So the Texas+Water Journal published an article, and one of the authors, I think, Carlos Rubenstein, I know he's been associated with your series. I think you interviewed him, and he was maybe, I think, part of the event that you had out in Midland or Odessa. I don't remember which one it was. And so that article, which I think the Journal published that in maybe 2016 or 17, was looking at boil water notices. And, there was a big spike after the drought ended in, I think, 2015. We're in a very bad drought here. For people who are not familiar with our recent history of drought, that started in the fall of 2010 was the worst single drought year in our state's instrumental history, going back to the late 1800s in 2011, and more or less ended with a flood, like a lot of these big droughts do. I think it was in 2015. And so after that, there were a whole bunch of boil water notices that were issued that seemed to be related to, okay, the drought has ended and systems are filling up with water again. And there's maybe a spike there, but it sounds like the spike has continued, that there has just been more and more since that period.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's kind of a two-prong problem whenever you really look into it, because, the issue of having so much water flowing through, that can really be harmful. That water pressure could really be harmful for, fragile infrastructure. We highlight a lot that there are some water systems in the state that are older than 70, 80 years old. There have been wooden water pipes found in various areas of the state. And so, that kind of water flowing through like that, it really can be a delicate situation. But then also, whenever you look at drought years, we know that extremely dry soil is contracting and putting pressure on the pipes underground.
Right.
And so when we have these prolonged droughts, that's certainly not helping the age of our pipes at all. But it also just kind of makes it more into kind of a domino effect when you think about it.
Right. Sure. The soil dries out and shifts, and you get breaks in pipes and things. And it's happening at the worst time, right? It's happening during a big drought. So one thing about the boil water notice issue that I'm curious about is I've always kind of had the reaction to boil water notices that it's a good thing that the state lets everybody know that there's an issue with a specific water supply. But the notice can be related to anything from there's contaminated water, or maybe there's just low pressure. And so I've often kind of wondered if that system is really, set up in the best manner that it could be, given that There are kind of a range of things that are covered under a boil water notice, and some are very serious, and some are not that serious, but are cautionary things that consumers would want to know. I'm just curious what your kind of reflection on that might be, having looked at all of these notices and the kind of circumstances in which they arose.
After kind of doing all of this research, I initially did have that same question. Maybe they do need to be more specific and say, hey, this contaminant's in your water, or, this is just because of low pressure. And, I think that would be really hard for the state to keep track of, seeing as how it's kind of already hard to keep track of boil water notices as it is. But I think it's also, kind of a better safe than sorry type of approach. This research has really shown me that these water problems escalate really fast. Even I mentioned the water line break last year in Odessa. That started as just a hairline fracture in the pipe before it just got more out of hand. And so I think that's why there isn't more nuance. And I think, maybe if there was, people would be paying more attention. Right. I mentioned earlier, I've always known that the water out here in West Texas is bad. And in the series, I highlighted a report that said that, there were 65 water systems, mostly out here in West Texas, that contained excessive levels of arsenic. And it had exposed more than 80,000 residents over 10 years. For me personally, I see that, and even, not knowing the nuance or not knowing how long or how far this traces to Lubbock, I'm still just kind of cautious. I still want to know, just for my own peace of mind. And, and I say that, living out here in Lubbock, I do know that there's arsenic in my tap water. We use a filter in our house religiously, and we only give our cats filtered water for the same reason. And, it's truly because we don't know what's in our water until we're feeling it in our bodies. And to me, once that realization clicked, I started to think, okay, these notices, they might be kind of annoying to see them pop up without really any context, but they're letting you know there's something up.
Right. Alejandra, do you want to add something?
Yeah, one of the, I guess, fears that I have is that these have become so prevalent that people don't always take them as serious or seriously. And I hope that this series highlighted in some way the importance of even doing what you can, like Jayme having a water filter at home, or we're not here to instill fear, but it is a worry about what is the quality, right? How water infrastructure is so tied to the water quality that we're drinking, I hear that a lot about, it's just another boil water notice. It'll be done in a couple hours. How seriously are people taking it? And also, how is that communication from state agencies to regular people happening? And is it the same every time? I pay attention to that a lot, because one thing I noticed in in a recent boil water notice is that, in Houston, I'm glad that they translated that information as well about the boil water notice.
So let's shift to water infrastructure now. So, one thing about your series, 3 years ago, you'd say water infrastructure, I don't know, people would not be paying attention, they're not be so interested in it. But, I'm just kind of looking back here. In 2021, I interviewed Mark Boyd, who chaired the development of the Texas, section of the American Society of Civil Engineers infrastructure report card on water, right? Their water portion of that. And, we talked about the bad ratings that Texas had gotten, and a whole, bunch of different areas related to water and our infrastructure. And at that time, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was moving through Congress, which is also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, which President Biden signed into law. And so, all of a sudden we had all this water infrastructure activity going on, and this, really landmark federal legislation to deal with aging water infrastructure and other infrastructure, other types of infrastructure, of course, in the United States. And the money coming to Texas, I think it's $3.5 billion, is the figure that I had seen back then for things specifically earmarked in Texas, and potential for other money to reach Texas through that federal act. And at the same time, the legislature, which is just about to finish up business here the next few days, is looks like we're going to have a new state water fund for water infrastructure, that is going to have $1 billion to $3 billion in it. We don't really know how it's going to turn out yet, but water infrastructure is it's having its moment. I don't know if we'll ever see another time in our life where people are talking about water infrastructure all the time, but they are. And so, your series comes along, and one of the things I'm curious about, you're talking to all these folks in rural Texas, and of course, we hear a lot of information about what people think about water from the large cities, from people who live in the urban centers. But I'm curious, were many of the people that you talked to who work for utilities, water utilities, et cetera, were they aware of the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act and the money there? And were they aware that the legislature was working on, another source of funding for water infrastructure? I'm kind of curious if they were tracking that or they're keeping an eye on it.
Yeah. So, before I answer that, I have to agree with you. Water infrastructure is having such a moment right now. Even at the water event that we hosted a few weeks ago, Omar Martinez from El Paso, he was really making a point to say no, we got to talk about water. We got to make water sexy again so people are interested in it. And
I always think it's sexy. That's just me.
I don't know why we can't have more, conversation starters based off of water. But, it just, once he said that really got me. And I think he's right. I think, water right now has everybody's attention. And so we got to take advantage of it while we have it. But with what you had asked, I did actually see, a lot of people out here who they were aware of not just the Federal Infrastructure Act, but also what the state lawmakers were pushing. And, as I mentioned earlier, they are the ones working in water districts, right? They're the city managers. So I'm not totally surprised that they were aware of these funds. But what really stands out is that they know that these funds are available. They just don't know exactly what they need to do to get them, to apply for them. They don't really have the manpower to go through all these different websites to finally get to where they can apply. And that's, part of the issues that we saw in our series as well.
Well, you hit on something I was going to talk about in a minute, but we'll talk about it now because you just brought up. So the state bill, Senate Bill 28 and Senate Joint Resolution 75, which are, in conference committee, I think now. The author in the Senate is Senator Perry, Charles Perry, who represents Lubbock, where you are. And he's chairman of the Senate Water, Agriculture, and Rural Affairs Committee. And so he probably, is very familiar with a lot of, what you reported, having that portion of the state in his district. And there's, many of the, I guess his constituents probably live in very small towns. Mm-hmm. But the amount of money, just kind of, putting that out there a little bit, the EPA says that Texas needs $60 billion in water infrastructure investment within the next 20 years. And that's keeping things going. That's not really new systems for additional people. That's, $60 billion, $3 billion a year, I guess, over 20 years to keep things operating smoothly. Plus, the state estimates that the new water plan, the 2022 water plan, will require $80 billion over the next 50 years to implement. And gosh, that's so much money. And when I think about what you brought up, what's required to get some of that money, if you're a small system that have one or two employees, I mean, the odds that you're going to have experience writing grants or know how to navigate doing that or have the time, I mean, it's absent, right? I mean, that expertise and that bandwidth is pretty unlikely, given that, I mean, we have 71, small water utilities, 7,100, sorry. I wish it was 71. That would make it easy. 7,100 across the state. Most of those are small. And, I just, we'll talk about that a little bit. I guess the frustration or the feeling that some of these folks had about their ability to get any of this money. I mean, do they look at this and say, no, that's never going to come here, or we're never going to be able to do that? Or was there some optimism that they would be able to get a little piece of that pie?
There was optimism with an edge of fight, right? An edge of determination. They know this money is going to happen, and there's no reason that these smaller communities shouldn't get it, just because they don't have somebody to go write grants for them. And that's even an issue that we see for rural communities in many areas. A few years back, I was speaking with the mayor of Stamford, with James Decker, and, he mentioned to me how they had lost their hospital a couple of years ago, and it was one of the last few in Jones County. And he had been looking up grants. He had been trying to find ways to really bring this money back, to bring something back to his community. And, this man is a mayor. He has a full-time job as a lawyer. And he was like, I can't do it all on my own, but we don't really have the people here who can. And that's something that we just see all around. And, whenever we're talking about billions of dollars, and these applications are obviously, it's going to be a competitive process. We don't want to think about it that way, but that's what it's going to turn into. They are going to have to fight to get that money, but they're ready to. There was a lot of that determination to make sure that some way, some form, their voices are heard. And I think that's even part of, where our reporting does kind of lend a hand in that situation. Alejandra, she wrote about the colonias, and they are mostly forgotten by people. And so, I'll let her talk on that more too, but that's really what it comes down to, is like, we are seeing the hunger for finding this money, regardless of if they completely have the resources to chase it or not.
Alejandra, you want to add to that?
Yeah. So some water experts say the colonias will see benefits and will maybe be eligible for this money. It prioritizes two specific groups of communities, these rural subdivisions that Jayme and Pooja covered, and incorporated towns with populations of less than 150,000. But colonias don't always fit into those two buckets. So it goes back to who has a chance, right? Who has a chance in getting that money. And a lot of water activists say if colonias aren't specifically written into this bill or into the language of, having a stake in this, they will be forgotten. But then going back to, do they have the resources to apply?
Right.
Like, let's say in they get to apply it, right? Then it's like, can they and how will they? I go back to a lot of the help that has mostly come for these communities have been from a bottom to top approach. These grassroots organizations, through like Texas A&M has a Colonias program that has been helping for decades. But they know they can't help with securing water infrastructure. So they help more with providing them with health benefits or guiding them towards where to find them. Because we go back to this whole thing about, if you don't have water infrastructure, what type of water are you drinking? What quality is that? What health impacts do you have because of that? So these communities are already behind significantly. How will they be able to apply for these grants? A lot of these grants require signatures from people who live there, kind of saying, I do want this. I talked to organizers with that Texas A&M Colonias program. Organizers call themselves, they're promotoras, they promote or they galvanize communities. And they say that a lot of them have lost hope. So we go back to your initial question. Did they know about this funding? Did they know about this money? A lot of them did not. And if I brought it up to them, the response that I kind of got from residents living in colonias was, oh, well, let's see how this time it goes. Or let's, kind of the sense of a little bit of, there's been a lot of broken promises, I feel like, for them. So, so now organizers are kind of saying, we know this money's coming. How do we get enough volunteers to maybe help some of the colonias who have a better chance in getting the money, going back to colonias that are closer to major cities like El Paso or like these bigger cities, McAllen, Brownsville, because they'll probably have a better chance in getting pipes to their homes.
So let me ask you this. This is based on my observations. There are places in the state that, don't really have a whole lot of potential for partnerships. And then there are other places that do. And one of the things I noticed is there was a real trend for many years of communities wanting to not be part of regional systems, but taking over their own systems so that they owned it and operated it themselves. And usually the result was not good. They were looking at their water systems and wastewater systems as kind of, cash cows is what, some people would call them. And then they'd realize, well, they really cost a lot to maintain, and the systems would get in trouble. And so one of the things that I'm curious about is, with 7,100 systems, right? And not much incentive for regionalization, wouldn't it make sense if there was a requirement for systems, smaller systems that are contiguous with each other, or, to cooperate and work together, to be able to make improvements regionally instead of doing it individually? Because if you think about it, the staff that you've got to have for each system, small system, if they're run individually, instead of grouped together. It's hard to have sufficient staff to have any kind of specialization on it, like somebody who works on grants. And so what I'm curious about is if you saw any examples where, hey, here's a small system, but, there's another one nearby and they're having problems. And, these communities probably could be working together to manage their systems, but they're not. What do you think?
I actually have seen that. And, I'm unbiased, but also proud, since Lubbock is basically, my home area. I'm proud that Lubbock is kind of one of the communities that's at the forefront of that. Lubbock has, over the years, kind of provided water to some of our smaller communities surrounding before. But, now there's kind of a bigger effort to make those partnerships more official. So like if you look at the partnership that they have with Wolfforth, Wolfforth was very much a small community whenever I was growing up. I remember I would essentially just kind of like drive through Wolfforth to get to Lubbock, and that was basically it. But they've grown a lot over the years, and they started to see issues with their water supply. And they came together with Lubbock, and the city leadership worked out a deal to where Wolfforth is now getting, or will start getting, some of Lubbock's water starting in June. And whenever I talked to Jared Atkinson, to Lubbock city manager, about that, he had no issue with it. He was saying, this kind of partnership doesn't just like better us, it betters them, it betters the South Plains. This kind of helps everybody. And he didn't see an issue with it. Alternatively, in response to this series, I did hear people who are, who say that they were former city leadership of other areas of Texas, who were very adamant that there's no reason that communities can't do this on their own, which I think, we've talked a lot over this last bit about why exactly that's not true. Why a lot of these communities, especially the smaller communities, do need that extra helping hand, because, otherwise they're just kind of stranded when you think about it. But I think it will just end up depending on where you ask. People like to say that Lubbock is one of the friendliest cities in Texas. Maybe that's why Lubbock's open to it. But we really don't know until we start to see more of these efforts happen. And, I think even though it's the smart idea, I think we could see some pushback if we were to try to require something like that, just because of, good old Texas rugged individualism.
I was about to bring that up. We're like from birth, like told, hey, we're the Lone Star State and you should be able to go it alone and stuff. And I think that's part of the issue. I mean, with some of these communities, like, why do we don't need to do it with them? We can do it ourselves.
Yeah, I think that is part of it. I think, there's definitely a reluctance to, ask for help, even though, some of these problems are definitely way in over the heads of the city leaderships of, the people who live there. We know that there is a certain point that the state needs to step in and also help those communities. And so, it's going to vary. Texans' attitudes vary by person. And so, we'll see. But to me, yeah, that's definitely the smart solution. And we are seeing a bill being pushed through to kind of help motivate that too. So, really, I think that's probably the future of our solutions. I just hope it's kind of an easy transition.
Alejandra, do you want to add anything to that? Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. Anything that we missed or I missed?
Something that, I love to talk about now that we did the math and we have this number, is the fact that, in 2021, we lost 132 billion gallons of water. And we really wanted to put, an image to that. We wanted to give it some context because even though it's obviously a large amount, some people can't really fully grasp it. So our data team did the math and they found that can fill the AT&T Stadium Stadium, the home of the Dallas Cowboys, 170 times over. And, with that being like the third biggest stadium in the NFL, that's very alarming. I just love sharing that number now that we have it.
So I gotta talk to you about that because so I read that and I'd seen that figure in some other publications, and then I did a little math, and so that's about 3% of the water use annually for the state. But I know that figure's got to be higher. I looked at that and I'm like, I bet it's higher than that. And of course, the total, say if we're using about 14.5 million acre feet annually, close to, sometimes it gets up. It was up to 18 million in the 2011 drought, but it's been hovering around 14.5 million in recent years. And, if 55 or 60% of that is going to agriculture, and, urban water use, municipal water use is 30%. So I'm not great at math here, but I'm like trying to get down to, maybe the figure to compare it to is 5 million acre feet. If maybe 5 million acre feet is going to municipal use out of that total, or 6 million, that figure looks more significant. The 136 billion gallons, which is about 417,000 acre feet. But still, I'm like, I bet it's higher. As you noted, like a lot of systems, they're required to report, but they don't because there's not any penalty.
Right. And, that's only for, I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head, so I apologize. But that's only for water systems that are over a certain amount of connections even. And so
it's like 3,000 or 3,300,
right.
Like that.
And, even though they do report annually, all those systems do report annually, the Water Development Board even notes in their own data that there's, so much more unreported water loss that they just kind of have to estimate. And so, like you were saying that, it's probably much, much more than we even realize.
It's a lot. Yeah. And in dry years, it becomes, a lot more. I mean, people really focus on it. Just kind of thinking about this legislative session, which is, it's the biggest session for water since 2013. Mm-hmm. And, it started out dry. And, I hate to see people going through a drought, but I was like, please don't rain yet, because like there's a lot of demands for that money that the legislature was trying to decide what to do with. And I've seen sessions where there was a big water bill and we were in a drought, and during the middle of the session, the state had a deluge, and that was kind of the end of that bill. And so it looks like we're going to get over the finish line with a new water fund, but still, I was a little concerned about that. So, yeah.
Well, and
I hope the drought ends now.
Well, it's interesting too, though, because out here in West Texas, we've had a lot of rainfall recently, and it's been surprising. The only thing, though, is that, there's that common misconception of oh, there was a drought, but it rained, so you're good, right?
Right.
And,
right.
We know that's not the case. I know that we've gotten several inches of water over the last, I would say, couple of days, maybe even the last week or so. And, even that, we still need much more to get out of how bad the drought was last year. And so, it's interesting to kind of see how this plays out. But yeah, I'm kind of with you. I'm kind of fingers crossed, y'all pay attention to the water bill. Don't pay attention to the rain out here.
Right. Yeah. It's the difference between meteorological drought and hydrologic drought. And, if you remember the legislature and you're driving through Austin now, there's wildflowers everywhere. And we've had them, for 2 months solid. It's like, it turned out to be a good wildflower year because of the timing of the rain. But local aquifers, the Highland Lakes, they're still in, not critical condition, but they're low. And some of the aquifers are still quite low. And so, it's not something that's really apparent readily. So I'm always concerned about that too.
Oh, yeah. I feel like I have kind of, in a way, somewhat become the farmers that I used to talk to growing up, because now I'm constantly like, oh, it's raining. This is really good. We needed this.
Yep. Okay. So it's time to start wrapping up. And so I know that if anybody wants, and they should, here's an endorsement, you should go read the Broken Pipe series was published by the Texas Tribune. And where else should our listeners find out more about, the work that you two are doing? Any other places that they might look, any other websites or something of that nature?
I would say just the Texas Tribune. I have, of course, past work, like you mentioned, my rural hospital series with Lubbock and PR. That's still on their website too, if people wanted to go check that out. But yeah, I would say mostly TexasTribune.org.
Alejandra, is that good? That's good with you?
Yeah, we have a whole page dedicated specifically for the Broken Pipes series. I think it's TexasTribune.org/Broken Pipes. And we also have, if people are interested in like climate environment reporting, there are pages specifically for that as well.
Can they see the live event? Do you have a recording of that there as well?
The live event, we have a web page that's within that Broken Pipes series page, and you can see the video and the discussion that was happening there.
Yep. Great. Look at that. We're going to hit right at an hour long. It's like, that's all planned. It's like, I never know how long we're going to go. So Jayme, Alejandra, thank you for joining us today. I really enjoyed this.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having us. It's always fun to talk about water.
It never gets boring, does it?
No.
So this has been Talk+Water, and my guests today were Jayme Lozano Carver and Alejandra Martinez. Both are reporters with the Texas Tribune, and they're authors of the Broken Pipe series, which the Tribune recently published and was focusing on rural Texas water infrastructure. I also want to thank you, the listener, for spending your valuable time on this podcast. And finally, I want to give a big thank you to Anna Huff at the Meadows Center for Water and the Environment at Texas State University for getting each episode of Talk+Water ready to flow. My name is Todd Votteler. Let's talk water again soon.